welcome to another edition of From the Pastor's Heart. Today, I'd like to finish our brief look at how Christianity changed the world. Now, this 4-week exploration that we've made is by no means exhaustive. I mean, Christianity has done more, as I have said, for good in the world than any other system of belief ever in the history of the world. And so I think this was a start. But today I'd like to discuss with you first how Christianity was the driving factor in the abolishing of slavery around the world. And then I want to briefly talk about the lessons I've learned in researching for these last 4 weeks. Now, before we begin, I need to tell you that slavery is not an invention of white Europeans and exported to the New World, where somehow everybody lived side by side and sang kumbaya. That slavery has been a part of humanity since the beginning. In fact, historian Alvin Schmidt writes, slavery was indigenous to African and Arab countries before it made its way to Europe. But by the time of Christ, in fact, slaves made up an estimated 75% of the population in ancient Athens, and well over half of the Roman population. Slavery was also widely practiced among many tribes of Native Americans long before Columbus set foot on the shores of the New World. And with few exceptions, kings, priests, and philosophers approved of it. In fact, Aristotle, who was an influential Greek philosopher, saw it as natural expedient and even just. Now, unlike in more recent history, when slaves performed only unskilled labor, in ancient Greece, for example, slaves not only did all of the menial work, but also the work that required skilled labor. The freeborn and property owners, the citizens in Greece, did not engage in manual labor at all. And this was also true in the Roman culture. So slaves performed virtually all of the physical or manual work. And so thus the Appian Way, the 7 wonders of the world, and even the beautiful sculptures from that period were actually the work of slaves. And every time present-day tourists are impressed by the magnificent ancient buildings and statues in Greece and in Rome, now which are mostly in ruins or badly damaged in the countries of the Middle East or even in Europe, they're looking at the products of slave labor. Now, many do not know that the tragedy of slavery continued in a number of countries for more than 100 years after it was outlawed in the United States in 1865. In fact, Ethiopia had slavery until 1942, Saudi Arabia until 1962, Peru until 1964, and India until 1976. Moreover, slavery still exists to this day in the Sudan, which is, of course, Africa's largest country. So when people don't know, and many do not, that slavery is still present today in countries like the Sudan, their ignorance is largely the fault of the mass media's reluctance to report it. Politically correct media and school textbooks give the impression that slavery has primarily been a sin committed by white people who enslaved blacks. But the fact that only 25% of the Americans in the South, for example, owned slaves before the Civil War, that's commonly not mentioned in our textbooks. Nor is the fact that according to the United States Census of 1830, for example, 407 black Americans just in Charleston, South Carolina alone owned black slaves. And I've taken a lot of flack over the years for saying that slavery has never been about race. It has always been about economics and specifically who is available to oppress. Now, nor have the mass media made any effort to report that a Christian organization in Sudan is known as Christian Solidarity International, currently, today, buys slaves, most of whom are black Christians, in order to set them free. Nor have the mass media reported that in the past several years, more than 3 million Sudanese Christians and animists, mostly slaves, have been executed. Now we know that Paul writes to his friend Philemon about his runaway slave Onesimus, who had become a Christian under the ministry of Paul. Now Onesimus wanted to go home to his believing master, and so Paul wrote to ask Philemon to no longer treat Onesimus as his one-time slave as a slave, but rather as a brother. Onesimus had run away and was being returned to Philemon, his owner. And Paul, in effect, told Philemon that as a Christian, he was no longer to practice slavery. Now, similarly, he told the Galatian Christians that from a Christian perspective, there was neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, for all are one in Christ Jesus. And given the culturally ingrained practice of slavery that existed for centuries in the ancient world, Paul's words were revolutionary. The Philemon and Galatians passages laid the foundation for the abolition of slavery then and also in the future. In addition to Paul's anti-slavery statements made to Philemon and to the church in Galatia, many other actions and statements that were incompatible with slavery soon surfaced in the early church, even though many Christians did not fully heed Paul's anti-slavery statements. Here are just a few examples of the changes that were happening as Christians interacted with slaves as they did with free men. Slaves worshiped alongside Christians, and this behavior contrasted sharply with the rest of the Roman world who held slaves in contempt. Slaves fared no better among the Greeks, whose philosopher Aristotle argued a slave is just a living tool, just as a tool is an inanimate slave. Therefore, there can be no friendship with a slave as a slave. Now, there are ample evidence that Christians freed slaves during the 2nd and the 3rd centuries. In fact, according to Robin Lane Fox, the early Christians were most numerous in the setting of urban households, and they were freeing of slaves was most frequent. He further states that the freeing of slaves was performed in church in the presence of the bishop. So how many slaves were freed during the early years of Christianity can never be known. I wish it could, but it can't. But there were many. The fact that there were many is illustrated by W.E.H. Lecky, who says St. Melania was said to have emancipated 8,000 slaves. And Chromatius, a Roman prefect under Diocletian, freed 1,400. St. Ovidus, a rich martyr of Gaul, freed 5,000. Hermes, who was a prefect under Trajan, freed 1,200, and many of the Christian clergy at Hippo, under the rule of St. Augustine, as well as great numbers of private individuals, freed their slaves as an act of piety. Now, it's also known that Constantine in AD 315, only 2 years after he issued the Edict of Milan, imposed the death penalty on those who stole children to bring them up as slaves. Now, freeing slaves not only took Christian conviction, but it also took courage as well. In fact, edicts issued by the Roman emperors did not favor liberating slaves. In time, however, an emperor, Justinian, from 527 to 565, came to power who was sympathetic to what his fellow Christians were doing. And so he abolished all laws that prevented freeing slaves. Now, this change, together with the numerous slaves who had already been freed and who were still being liberated, was consistent with what some of the leading theologians had been saying. Early in the 4th century, Lactantius, the Christian Cicero, his Divine Institutes, said that in God's eyes, there were no slaves. St. Augustine saw slavery as a product of sin and contrary to God's divine plan, and he wrote that in the City of God. St. Chrysostom, in the 4th century, preached that when Christ came, he annulled slavery. He proclaimed that in Christ there is no slave. Therefore, it is not necessary to own one. Buy them, and then after you have taught them some skill by which they can maintain themselves, he said, set them free. Slavery was also condemned in the 5th century by St. Patrick in Ireland, for example, one of my heroes in the faith. And for several centuries, bishops and councils recommended the redemption of the captive slaves. And for 5 centuries, the Christian monks redeemed Christian slaves from Moorish slavery. So by the 12th century, slaves in Europe were rare. And by the 14th century, slavery was almost unknown on the continent. The honor, acceptance, and freedom that Christianity extended to slaves resulted in multitudes of them embracing this new faith. Some even became priests of the church. In the early 3rd century, Callistus, a one-time slave, became not only a priest, but also a bishop. And in fact, the Roman Catholic Church lists him as one of its early popes. St. Patrick was a slave to the Erse people, and he escaped, and he had a heart for the Erse people so much that he put himself back into slavery so that he could reach them for Christ. Although slavery in Europe had virtually come to an end by the 14th century, it's important to remember that in spite of Paul's words to Philemon and to the church in Galatia, for more than 1,000 years, many Christians had owned slaves. But this included even prominent church leaders such as Polycarp, a 2nd century bishop of Smyrna, others such as Clement of Alexandria and Origen. Both 3rd century church fathers spoke approvingly of slavery. Similarly, in the 13th century, St. Bonaventure saw slavery as a divine institution. And in 1548, Pope Paul III granted to all men and to the clergy the right to keep slaves. Now, the erring Christians, the Christians who were wrong, who supported and owned slaves, indicates that at least 3 important truths. First of all, we see that sinful beings, as sinful beings, they were either ignorant of Paul's words or they ignored them. Second of all, they let the prevailing culture of pagan societies influence their behavior. And third, they ignored Christ's words that said his followers were to be in the world, but not of it. And this is something that we're dealing with today, is the fact that slavery and human trafficking is alive and well today. And in fact, it has been said that the largest purveyor of human trafficking is actually our own government. Now, it's important to note that although by the 14th century slavery had essentially come to an end in Europe, including England, it was revived by the British in the 17th century, especially in England's colonies. A London Church Council decision of 1102, which had outlawed slavery and the slave trade, was ignored. Slaves were transported from Africa to the colonies in the British West Indies, as well as to the American colonies and to Canada. The Portuguese and the Spanish also went to Africa to get slaves, and they shipped them to their colonies in Brazil and Central America, and even to parts of Central America. This revival of slavery was lamentable because this time it was implemented by countries whose proponents of slavery commonly identified themselves as being Christian. Whereas during the African and Greco eras, slavery was the product of pagans. However, some serious-minded Christians saw slavery as a gross violation of basic Christian beliefs and values. And before too long, some courageous individuals came to the forefront of this battle against slavery. One such, of course, courageous abolitionist was William Wilberforce, who lived from 1759 to 1833. He was a member of England's House of Commons. He was a gifted orator, and he delivered many powerful speeches. during his 20-some years in Parliament against Britain sending slaves to the West Indies. In fact, according to his biographer, his speeches were most effective when he appealed to the Christian consciousness of Englishmen. In 1823, 2 years before he had to relinquish his seat in the House of Commons because of ill health, he presented a petition to the House of Commons to abolish slavery, a petition that a close associate of his, Thomas Fowell Buxton, moved a resolution declaring slavery repugnant to Christianity and the Constitution. A few days, in fact, before he died on July 26, 1833, he received word that Parliament had passed the Abolition Act. And this act resulted in freeing of 700,000 slaves by England in its West Indies colonies. Upon hearing this good news, he exclaimed, "Thank God that I should have lived to witness a day in which England is willing to give 20 million sterling for the abolition of slavery." Now, it's difficult to find a better example than Wilberforce to show the powerful effect the teachings and the Spirit of Christ have had in fighting the social sin of slavery. No proponent of for the abolition of slavery ever accomplished more. Largely as the result of his efforts, slavery came to a complete end in all of the British Empire's possessions by 1840, making it the first modern country to outlaw slavery. Even after slavery came to an end in the British Empire in the 1830s, it continued unabated to the north and the south of the adjacent British West Indies, most notably in the United States, Brazil, and Mexico. In the United States, it had become a deeply entrenched institution, especially in the southern states, despite the fact that only about 25% of Southerners actually owned slaves. Given that this peculiar institution, as it was often called, was so firmly entrenched in the South, it had many ardent defenders. Unfortunately, many of them called themselves Christians. In fact, virtually every American church denomination had a pro-slavery advocates in support of their position, and they cited man's innate sinfulness, historical precedent, and black people's perceived inferiority and economic necessity. Now, a common argument in favor of slavery was its presence in the Old Testament. Now, here they engaged in a faulty reasoning, horrible exegetical work, giving descriptive passages in the Bible prescriptive meaning. Rather than just reporting on what was said, they actually turned it into something that people should be doing. And slavery became an intensely heated issue politically and even theologically in both the American North and the South. Now, this occurred despite the fact that the United States had received a relatively low percentage of the 10 million African slaves that had been imported into the New World between 1502 and the 1860s. It had received about 7%. Brazil received 41%. The British and the French colonies in the Caribbean, along with the Spanish settlements, 47%, and the Dutch, Danish, and Swedish colonies, 5%. I mean, it just so even though there's a smaller percentage, of course, we talk about that more here in America. I understand that. So pro-slavery advocates and defenders were not backward, nor were they illiterate. For the most part, they were well educated. Some were presidents of colleges in the North. And among the pro-slavery clergy, for example, Yale and Princeton had the highest representation. But although slavery in America was condoned and defended by many who were members of the Christian denominations, there were also very strong countervailing voices of the prominent Christian leaders who came to be known as abolitionists. The Christian abolitionists not only had the mind of Christ and powerful references of the New Testament on their side, but they also had noteworthy anti-slavery precedents in Christian history. Many American defenders of slavery, as have already been mentioned, called themselves Christians, and every state also had its clergy who argued that slavery was compatible with a biblical Christianity. But the abolitionist movement had a considerably higher percentage of Christian clergy than did the pro-slavery defenders. In fact, 2/3 of abolitionists in the mid-1830s were actually Christian clergymen. In most of the anti-slavery discussions in American history, books and articles, a rather significant event is commonly and unfortunately overlooked. This event happened more than a century before the American abolitionist movement arose, when an unknown German immigrant issued America's first formal proclamation against slavery in 1866. He was Franz Daniel Pastorius. He was a Mennonite who spoke several languages, and he studied law in Germany. William Penn met him in Germany, and where he and a number of other Germans were persuaded to migrate to the colony of Pennsylvania. Upon arriving in America, Pastorius purchased 5,000 acres of land and founded Germantown, which is Pennsylvania, now in the suburbs of Philadelphia. When Pastorius came to Pennsylvania in 1683, he soon encountered slavery, which in those days was not unusual even in the North. So Negro slavery was repulsive to him and his fellow German settlers, most of whom were Mennonites from the Rhine River Valley, and they couldn't understand how Quakers could harmonize slavery with their religious beliefs. And he became the forerunner of the abolitionist movement. So after slavery was abolished in America, there was still an issue of racism, unfortunately, to be dealt with. And it was the church that was the driving force behind the anti-segregation legislature. Christians who believed the biblical account of creation understood that there is only one race on this planet. And judging a person by the amount of melanin that they had in their skin made no sense whatsoever to them. Now, we have Darwin to thank for the racism that grew in the beginning of the 20th century. Darwin believed that the black man was the lowest of all the races on Earth, and he taught that in his book, The Origin of Species. So Christians believe that the person should be judged based on the content of their character rather than the color of their skin. So Martin Luther did not make this up by himself. Preachers had been preaching this truth in America for generations. And so my point is this, folks, is that the driving force behind the abolition of slavery in the Western world has been Christianity. It has been the church. And so it should not surprise us in places where the church is persecuted, when you have other organizations and other religious systems taking the forefront, you also find slavery. Why is that? Because the thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy. So I'd like to finish this talk, and I thank you for making it to the end, by laying out three observations. Three observations that I made while I was looking at and studying this important topic. And the first is the fact that all people are created in the image of God. And because of that, they have intrinsic value. So as long as you have a system or society that denigrates the value of the human being and of people who bear the image of God, you're always going to have issues with slavery. That's why we have such a high human trafficking issue here in America, and you have politicians and you have entire political parties who are complicit in this by keeping away legislation that would help us to fight it. And so like I say, that you've got, as long as Planned Parenthood is around, they are the human traffickers' best friends, because they can take care of any of the fallout from these young women who many of them are being sold into slavery. And then that just by killing the result of this illicit trade. And so we need to get back to the idea of the intrinsic value of human beings, just because we all bear and we all carry the image of God. The second thing is that the Christians who made a difference in the abolition of slavery were more interested in following the Bible than being liked by the world. And so I think that one of the main things that clergymen who were in favor of slavery, what they had in common was they wanted to be liked by the world. And folks, you can't serve two masters, Jesus said. Third thing is that believers were united in their convictions. Those are the ones who actually made the difference. The abolitionists, the Wilberforces, the Wesleys, the others, that they were, that especially in leadership, that they were united in the conviction that this horrible institution was evil. Fourth, they were in it for the long haul. They didn't give up when persecution came and people started to say horrible things about them. They continued because the right thing is always the right thing no matter what. Fifth, they refused to buy the world's narrative. Of course, the world's narrative is that there are some people who are more valuable than others. And so if somebody is not as valuable as somebody else, then it's okay, and it's actually moral to put them into this incredible evil known as slavery. And then finally, they offered a better way. That they were able to bring about the freedom that comes in Christ, that no other institution, no other religious organization can offer, because it's only in Christianity, it's only in following the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords do we actually have complete and total freedom. That freedom to display the glory of God with all that we are. And so, again, I thank you for making it to the end of this. And I pray that you really stop and think about how much Christianity has done to make the world a better place. So I pray that as you are worshiping with your siblings in Christ this week, you have an incredible time in His presence. And I look forward to seeing you again in a future video. God bless y'all.